around to the checkout counter while I waited for them to grab what they needed. I noticed there weren't any cars outside though, which explained why I didn't hear them pull in. I watched them look around for a minute at the candy aisle. Then they picked up a bag of Dum Dum lollipops and tossed them on the counter. "Find everything you needed?" They didn't say anything. I rang it up and told them the total. They paid in cash. As I was doing the transaction though, I couldn't help but notice one of them in the back staring at me. Through the mask, I could only see his eyes, but they were locked on me and looked frustrated or angry or something. It made me really uncomfortable. I finished up and told them to have a good night. There was a pause though, before one of the men walked up to the front door and pulled down the bolt lock. My stomach dropped. The one that was staring at me then immediately came around the counter and shoved me onto the ground. I tried to stay calm and told them to take the money and that I wouldn't stop them. However, the other man walked around the counter and right past the register. They weren't here for the money. He forced zip ties around my hands and lifted me onto my feet. I was completely helpless as they dragged me through the store, and after briefly checking outside, they rushed me out the entrance. It was only as they dragged me toward the side of the building that I noticed an old car sitting in the grass outside the parking lot. As we reached the edge of the parking lot though, a sudden glaring light came over top us. It was a police car pulling into the lot. The three men dropped me on the pavement and sprinted into their car. I don't know if it just was that their car wouldn't start, or they gave up, or what, but the officers were able to get them before they got away. Backup showed up not even 30 seconds later. I guess what happened was earlier in the night, the police got a report of three men in costumes offering kids candy on the sidewalks and trying to lead them away from houses. That's why I kept seeing a patrol car circling the area. What they wanted to do with me, or any of the kids, isn't for sure, as none of the men confessed anything. It almost makes me glad that everything happened the way it did though, because if I'd sold them that candy and heard later on that it was used to kidnap kids with, I probably would have felt a ton of guilt. Thankfully, it didn't have to go that way. It was mid-November. Winter had just started coming in, and snow had already begun covering most of our small town. I lived alone in a very small two-bedroom home that had an unfinished basement. The only time I went down there was to do laundry or get something out of storage. It was a Friday night, and it had been snowing a decent amount during my drive home from work. I had the next 2 days off though, so I was happy to get home and hunker down for the weekend. I got home at 7. I made dinner and watched the new episode of my show, then turned on YouTube in the background as I laid on the couch and scrolled on my phone. The snow must have picked up as I could hear the wind slamming against the house and making the walls creak. Sometime around 10, I got up to use the restroom, but as I walked down the hallway, I heard something below me. I immediately stopped, hoping to recognize it as just the house creaking, but it wasn't. There was something moving around in the basement. I didn't know how that could be possible. I went over to the basement door and opened it, turning on the lights and walking down to the bottom. There were only a couple hanging light bulbs across the ceiling to light up the large open area. I didn't see much of anything though. I stood there for a minute just to see if that sound came again, but after hearing nothing else, I went back upstairs. Given the conditions outside, I figured it had to just be the house moving around. I used the restroom and went back to the couch. However, only a minute later, I heard it again. This time it was more clear. It wasn't a creaking sound. It was subtle thumps, like almost identical to what it would sound like if someone was walking around. I could feel my heart beat faster, but I still felt like there was no way someone could be down there. It just wouldn't be possible. I got up again and went up to the basement door. Now that I was there, I couldn't hear it. I walked down to the bottom. The sound of the wind was loud down there, so I wasn't able to hear anything over the low groan of the house. But on the cement floors, there were shoe prints. They were fresh, too, only showing because of the dusty layer that covered the floor. I was absolutely terrified. I ran back upstairs and grabbed the house phone to dial 911. As I told the operator all the necessary information, there were 2 very loud thuds from the basement. After that, I sprinted out of the house. A couple officers showed up a reasonable time later, and when they went inside, they didn't find anything aside from the prints on the floor. Strangely, they seemed to lead right up to the bottom of the basement steps, and nowhere else. They really didn't know what to tell me, other than to call if anything else happens. I booked a hotel for the next 2 nights, as I was too uneasy to sleep in my own home. With no signs of a break-in anywhere, it's really hard to say who was in my basement, or even how they got in or out. Part of me thinks it might have not even been a person at all, though I'm still really skeptical. I just hope that whoever or whatever it was doesn't come back. This was way back in 2014. I was in 6th grade and had a small group of friends that I was going trick-or-treating with on Halloween. Now, every time before this, one of our parents always felt the need to tag along, which never let us have the full experience, knowing we were being watched and had to behave. But this year, we were free to do as we please, so we wanted to make the best of it. It was me and my friends Johnny, Colton, and Wes. After school on Halloween day, we all got into our costumes and met up at Colton's place, then started making our rounds. Honestly, I don't think any of us thought it would take so long to go through Colton's neighborhood. Most of the houses had good stuff though, even full-sized candy bars at some of them. It was about 8 o'clock when we made it to the other neighborhood. None of us had ever really been there, but it had even bigger houses that we knew had to have the best candy. It was pretty dark out now, and these houses were more covered by trees, so it probably wasn't a good idea to go there. But of course, we still did. We went down the street, stopping at 10 or so houses, when we went up to the last one on the block. This one was noticeably more spread out, further from the other houses, and it looked older, like it was probably there before all the other houses were built around it. Johnny wanted to skip it and turn the corner to the next block, as he thought there was something off about it. But the rest of us didn't listen. We walked up to the porch and rang the doorbell. They had a few carved pumpkins on their doorstep, so we thought they probably had stuff to hand out. But we waited for a good 30 seconds and didn't hear anything inside, so we started to walk off the porch when we suddenly noticed a person by the garage. He was walking toward us. He was an older guy, maybe 50, and he had a big smile. "If you'll wait just a minute, I can get y'all some candy. I just picked up more from the store." We never saw him pull in though, and he kind of seemed to come out of nowhere. We said it was okay, and that maybe we'll come back around. His smile fell flat as we walked away. All of us felt a little weird after that, so we moved on to the next block. There was something about that guy that was just creepy. All of us felt it too, which made us feel like there might have actually been something wrong with him. We went up to a few more houses though, but it was starting to get really dark out, and we decided to head back to Colton's place to spend the rest of the night there. Instead of going back the way we came, we turned down the next street that was in the direction of the main road. This one only had a couple houses on it, and the rest was just forest. There weren't even many lights on the road. I think all of us were a little uneasy walking down there, as most of us had even stopped talking. Then, out of nowhere, there were footsteps beside us, coming from the trees. That guy came walking up to us. He had that creepy smile again and tried waving at us as he made his way through the brush and trees and onto the road. All of us backed up as he started talking. I didn't even hear what he said before he lunged toward Colton. Somehow he didn't get him, and all of us sprinted away before anything else could happen. We didn't stop running until we got to the main road. We crossed back into Colton's neighborhood and felt way more safe, so we caught our breath and started walking again. The walk back to his place was only 10 minutes, but around halfway there, an old gray sedan with tinted windows started passing by us. The first time we barely noticed, but they circled around 2 more times, slowing down each time they passed us. We picked up the pace and got back inside Colton's house. None of us really knew what to do after that point. Stupidly, we chose not to tell anyone because we thought they would have never let us out alone anymore. We never saw that guy again though. What he would have done is unknown. I was staying at a cabin for the weekend. It was in a campground an hour from where I lived. Being that I lived in the heart of the city, I always liked to go stay out in the forest for a few days during fall so I could enjoy the nice weather and colorful trees. This wasn't a fancy campground. It was only $10 a night, and the cabins were only 200 square feet. Basically one small room with a bed in the middle. The first day I was there, I spent most of my time outside. There were a few small trails I went on. The second day, I sat outside in a lawn chair that was set up behind the cabin. The leaves blowing in the wind was such a nice sound to listen to that I could have sat out there forever. I don't know how long I actually sat out there for, maybe 3 or 4 hours. At some point though, I spotted a person out in the woods. They were far out, like 150 yards from me, and were just standing between the trees, not moving at all. From what I could tell, it looked like he was looking right at me. I wasn't sure though, so I just stayed there and waited for a few minutes. After that, I started getting creeped out, being unable to tell if he was looking at me or not. I went back inside and stayed in until sunset. The wind got louder and more hectic after the sun went down. Inside the cabin, it was really loud, especially with the windows not being properly sealed. The wind was making that high-pitched swooshing sound all night. Normally I wouldn't mind, but I think it made me nervous because I knew I wouldn't be able to hear the leaves crunch if someone was approaching my cabin. Seeing that guy earlier just put me in an uneasy mood. I lit up the fireplace though and sat on the sofa chair, trying to wind myself down for the night. An hour or so passed before there was a sudden knock at the front door. I jumped up from my chair, being fully startled by it. After a few seconds, they knocked again. I could feel my heart racing. It had to be almost 9 p.m. by now, so someone knocking at my cabin in the woods was extremely unsettling. I didn't know if I should say something or stay quiet. I ended up staying quiet, just out of hesitation, but they continued to knock until the knocks became hits. Over and over, it started sounding like they might actually break down the door. Then it stopped. There was a whole long minute of silence as I stood and waited for whatever the hell was going to happen next. Wondering if they left, I moved up to the door as quietly as I could and looked out the peephole. There was nobody outside. I felt a slight bit of relief. I looked for another 30 seconds just to be sure. Then I backed up and turned to get my phone, only to see a pair of eyes piercing into mine through one of the old windows. As soon as we made eye contact, his head moved out of sight. Then it was quiet again. The wind blowing around made it 100 times more eerie. I got my phone and called the police. I didn't want to risk running out to my car that was parked across the yard, so I stayed inside and waited for the police to show up. Whoever was outside my cabin must have left, as police made it and found no one. I still don't know what really happened at that cabin, but I've never gone back since. I was on my way to deliver an order from the sandwich shop I worked for. It was a quiet night, around 11 or so. I had my music playing in my car, and I was just running through the motions of the delivery. On my way to their neighborhood, I pulled up to a red light. There was nobody else at the intersection, but for some reason, the light stayed red for what felt like an abnormal amount of time. As I sat there and stared at the light, waiting for it to change, a car pulled up beside me. I only glanced over for a second, not wanting to make that awkward eye contact, but their windows were heavily tinted, like definitely more than what was legal, as I couldn't see a single thing through them. The car itself was black as well, maybe an old Toyota or something. I can't really pinpoint what it was, but I got a really uneasy feeling about them. It could have just been that we were the only two on the road. I'm really not sure. Eventually the light turned green, and I started going. I didn't get very far though, before noticing they hadn't moved. They were still parked at the intersection. Once I got further down the road, I shrugged it off, and just thought it was weird, and nothing else. A couple minutes later, I pulled off into the section of housing that the delivery was in. I'd say neighborhood, but it wasn't really a neighborhood. It was just a line of 10 or so houses, leading to a dead end. Something about it seemed really off-putting. Of all the houses on the street, not a single one had a light on. I 100% would have thought these places were abandoned, if not for the fact that the houses themselves looked really nice. They looked like ordinary neighborhood homes, with not a single sign of anything wrong with them. I figured it had to just be a coincidence that every resident down the street had their lights off. Anyway, the address I had was for the second to last house. I pulled up and parked on the curb, getting out with the order and walking up to the door. I was hoping I'd at least see some sort of light coming through the windows of this house, because it was the one I was delivering to, but standing on the porch, I didn't see any light. Reluctantly, I knocked on the door. When I did, the door swung a bit from its hinges, like it wasn't properly shut or locked. Now this was even more odd. "Sandwich delivery. Anyone home?" It was completely silent. No response, and not even the slightest sound from inside the house. I was gonna leave, but just to be sure I didn't miss anything, I cracked the door open a little further. I could see a hallway and a room. Both were empty of any furniture or decorations, not even a single picture on the wall. It only took a few seconds before dust started coming through the doorway too. I shut it and backed up from the porch. I was very confused and slightly worried. As I walked back down to my car though, I noticed something down the road. A few houses back, there was a small black car that wasn't there when I pulled in. Its headlights were off, and it was parked. Once I saw the tinted windows, I immediately recognized it. I felt my face go white, knowing this could not possibly be a coincidence at this point. I started to hurry to my car, but as I got just a few feet away from the road, I saw something move in the reflection of one of the windows. I wasn't sure what it was that I saw, but I stopped in place. I was standing near the passenger door, and through the window, my eyes fell on the back seat. It was dark, but there was something blocking the back window. It only took me about a second for me to realize what I saw. I turned and bolted back to the house. As I did, the back door to my car swung open, and a man in a black hoodie and black pants came running out. He didn't chase me though. He ran straight down to the road and into his car. I stayed on the porch, and with my heart pounding, I dialed 911. I probably could have gotten in my car and left at that point, but I was too scared to really think straight. Police arrived and immediately told me that this whole street was unoccupied, as the homes were new builds. Guess that explains why I thought they looked so nice and not abandoned. What I definitely didn't expect was to hear them say that they've had multiple reports this past week, very similar to mine. The guy would order something for delivery with a fake name and address, then follow the driver. What happened to me was the closest call of any of them though. The guy had snuck inside my car and was waiting for me to get in and maybe even drive away. Who knows what he was trying to do. Unfortunately, there haven't been any updates on finding him. I was 20 and worked with my parents at a really small takeout restaurant. We specialized in to-go orders. I was in college at the time and was on a very hectic schedule, but my parents were kind enough to offer me a laid-back position just as a general worker. Usually just working the to-go table, or cleaning up the place after closing hours. This was during early December, and with finals coming up, I didn't have much time to work during the day, so I was taking up mostly late night shifts, where I'd just clean for a few hours, then head home. One of the nights I was working, I noticed around an hour into my shift that a car was parked in the parking lot. The way our restaurant was laid out, it was a standalone shop with a tiny parking lot in front of it, so there was no crossover between other stores or businesses. I thought whoever parked there probably just didn't think anyone would care, and they were right, because I really didn't care. 20 or so minutes later, they left. However, the next night, around the same time, the car pulled into the parking lot again. The first time it was fine, because I thought it was just a one-time thing, but coming back again was strange. I walked up to the front of the building and looked out. It was an older gray sedan with dark windows. They didn't seem to be trying to hide or anything, because they were facing right at the building and they kept their headlights on. I double-checked that the doors were locked before getting back to cleaning. It was hard not to feel like they were watching me through the giant glass front windows, but just like last time, they left not too long after. I finished up my work and clocked out an hour later. Walking to my car in the parking lot, I felt really uneasy. I knew they had left, but it was just concerning that the same car came by 2 nights in a row for seemingly no reason. I drove home and got some rest. Having a lot of schoolwork to do, I decided to take off the next night, so I didn't return to work until the following night. The whole time I was inside cleaning, I had this anxious feeling that made me constantly look out the windows, expecting that car to come back at any point, but I never saw them pull in. I was inside for nearly 3 hours and finished everything I had to do, and not having seen the car come by this night, I felt like maybe it really was all nothing. I packed my stuff up and headed out, locking the door behind me. As I walked through the parking lot, that anxious and uneasy feeling rushed back to me. It felt like I suddenly got a burst of adrenaline, making me sweat and look in all directions. Then, as I was halfway across and standing out in the open, my eyes spotted a car sitting in the far back of the parking lot, away from all the street lamps that lit up the area. Within seconds, it started moving, quickly driving toward me. I sprinted to my car, but I could hear their tires skidding on the pavement as they sped up right beside me and slammed on the brakes. I stumbled forward, thinking they were about to hit me. I was only a few feet away from my car at this point, and suddenly the doors of their car swung open. I didn't even turn my head to look, having my focus completely on getting into my car. Footsteps rushed behind me just as I opened my car and got in. Through the windows, I saw 3 men wearing masks and hoodies sprinting up to me. My hands were shaking as I tried to get my car to turn on. The men started banging on the windows and trying to get the doors open, but I barely got it in drive and drove past them. I got out of the parking lot and onto the road, and from there, I was safe. I called 911 and pulled into a well-lit gas station nearby to wait for them. Unfortunately, the outside of our shop didn't have any cameras, so the information the police had to go off of was minimal. I couldn't even see any of the men's faces. After that night, it's no surprise that I never saw the car or the men again. This was last year toward the beginning of December. One of my good friends was going on a trip with his family and would be gone for a whole week. He asked if I wanted to house sit his place while they were gone. We were really good family friends, so this wasn't all that unusual. I actually did the same thing for them last year as well. They had a couple fish tanks and a lot of houseplants that they needed me to take care of while they were away, and in return I'd get to stay at their house for a week. I lived in a really small apartment, so I was always glad to take them up on the offer and help out. I headed over a couple hours before they left, just to hang out and get a refresher on everything that I needed to do. Once they left, I unpacked some things and got settled in, and around 6, I went out to pick up some dinner. I brought it back to the house and ate in the living room while watching TV. Only a half hour later, there was a knock at the door. I paused the show and got up, looking to see who it was. It was a man in his 30s. He wasn't wearing a delivery uniform or anything. He just looked like a regular dude. I cracked the door open and asked what he needed. He looked startled to see me, but quickly recovered and asked if my friend was home right now. He called him by his name, so I thought he might have been a friend or something, but I told him he'd have to come back some other time. He didn't ask anything else and just walked away. I probably should have asked what he needed, but I felt like he should have told me to begin with. I was sure it was nothing, but I texted my friend just to let him know who came by. He called me soon after and asked who he was, and after a brief conversation, he said he had no idea who that guy could have been. I kept an eye out for the rest of the day, but still felt like it was probably nothing serious. I watched TV for a while, then went around the house watering the plants and feeding the fish. Around 9, I started getting the couch set up for bed. I tossed a few blankets down and made a little sleeping area. As I did, there was another knock at the door. I walked over, more confused than anything, but was immediately unnerved to see the same guy outside the door. This time, I didn't open it. "Hey, what do you need? Can you come back a different day?" I yelled through the door. I watched as the man listened and stared at the door like he was thinking, but instead of responding, he just walked away again. I made sure the door was locked before going back to the couch. It was then that I definitely should have called the police, but for some reason I really didn't want to. Especially being at someone else's house, I was worried that this was all just a misunderstanding. Not to mention, the guy hadn't actually done anything yet. I would just have to explain that he came by twice and stood at the door. It kind of sounds silly, honestly. It definitely woke me up though, and I didn't feel comfortable going to bed right away. I stayed up on my phone and had the window curtains open so I could see if he walked up again. I probably waited for a good 2 hours before my eyes started getting heavy. I did one last check out the windows before closing the curtains and getting ready for bed. I brushed my teeth, then hopped in the shower to quickly rinse off. By the time I got out, dried off, and went back downstairs, it had been less than 10 minutes. I went around and turned off all the lights, and before getting in bed, I figured I'd do one last check out the windows, just to help me sleep easy. I looked out, seeing nothing but trees swaying in the wind and the empty road in front of the house. I stepped back, and as I went back over to the couch, my eyes drifted toward the front door, catching something off. The lock was sideways. I walked over, thinking I was seeing things wrong, but no, it was unlocked. I was completely certain I'd locked it, not even a doubt in my mind. I froze up for a second before I felt adrenaline surge through me. I turned around and crept over to the couch to grab my phone that I left on the end table, but it wasn't there. Someone had already taken it. I didn't stay a second longer, grabbing my keys and running out the front door. I used the emergency button in my car to call 911 as I pulled out of the driveway and parked further down the road to wait. When police pulled up and searched the home, they found the man, same one that came by twice, sitting in one of the spare bedrooms. When they arrested him, he didn't say a word, like he was completely mute. They found a forged key in his pocket that matched the front door, and nobody knows how he got it. My friend told me again that he had no clue who the man was or why he'd break into his home, but it honestly felt like there was something he wasn't telling me. Suspiciously, we haven't talked much after that either. I don't know what was going to happen that night. If I didn't notice the door was unlocked and went to bed, I really don't think I would have woken up. It was a normal night after work, getting home at 10. I was exhausted, but ready to stay up late and game. All my buddies worked early tomorrow, so I was just playing solo and relaxing. A few hours into the night, I heard what sounded like a knock. I took my headphones off and listened for it again, but it was quiet now. I thought surely it had to be a knock at the front door, as it was pretty loud and I didn't know what else it could be. I went over to check it out, but nobody was on the porch. The more I thought about it, a single knock would have been odd if there were someone at the door. I still didn't know what it was that I heard, but I went back to gaming. It must have only been a half hour later that I heard another sound. It was a sort of click, like something closing. I immediately took my headset off and looked behind me. Again, the house was quiet now. I got up and did a walkthrough of the house. I didn't thoroughly check every inch of the place. I was just trying to spot any obvious signs of what I'd been hearing. The house was fairly old, so usually I chalk these things up to being the aging wood. After checking around and not seeing anything, that's exactly what I did, and I went back to my desk. I was still a little hesitant to put my headset back on, but eventually I did anyway. Only a couple minutes later though, a reflection suddenly moved across my computer screen. Maybe it was a shadow, I don't know, but I jumped up and spun around. This time, it was almost like I knew, without a doubt, that someone was inside my home and had just walked somewhere behind me. My desk was in the living room, so there was a long hallway behind it with 3 separate rooms, and at the end was the front door. I took a few seconds to recollect myself and think about which way the reflection moved across my screen, and realized it had moved from the left side of the hallway to the right side. There was only one door on the right, which was to my bedroom. It felt like in that moment, the silence of the whole house was deafening, making each second pass feel more and more terrifying, knowing almost for sure that someone else was in that room. I decided my best bet was to just run for the front door and hope whoever was in the room didn't jump out at me. After a few seconds, I forced myself to move, running down the hall and through the front door. I heard nothing as I fled the house. I called the cops and waited outside for several long minutes. They went in, and I still couldn't believe it when they pulled a man out the front door. I knew someone had broken in, but actually seeing it was really unsettling. He looked around 55, but was very large. His face was uncanny, with wide, bloodshot eyes and a disheveled beard. Even worse, they found 2 knives on him. It seemed he had no particular reason for choosing me as a victim of whatever he was trying to do, which I guess was supposed to make me feel better, but honestly, it didn't. It just means he was completely insane and would have done anything without hesitation had he had the chance to. I think I just got really lucky that night to even be standing here today. I used to work for a small startup company. I'm not even really sure what they did because I was just a security person, but I always thought it was a little strange that they even felt they needed a security guard. The office was really small and looked somewhat unimportant, like any other office. It made my job easy though, because I didn't have to parade around multiple floors all night. I got in at 9 and turned on the security alarm systems, then headed to the little security room that had all the camera screens set up. The place only had outdoor cameras, which were really low quality. The first couple hours went by slowly, with the usual nothing going on. Sometime around 1 a.m. though, I heard what sounded like a latch clicking shut. I sat there confused for a moment, then stood up and opened the door to the hallway. Everything looked exactly how I'd left it. There were only 3 doors down the hallway, and each one was closed. I walked over to each door, opening them and briefly looking around. The rooms were layered with a bunch of office desks, but from what I could see, it was all normal. By now, it had been long enough for me to start wondering if the sound I heard was actually what I thought it was. Maybe I just didn't hear it right. After all, the security systems should have triggered an alarm if someone had opened one of the main doors to get inside. So I went back to the room, this time leaving the door open to the hallway, so if I heard it again, it'd be more clear. Then I sat back and continued monitoring the cameras. I checked the footage from the previous few minutes just to see if I missed anything, but I didn't see anything at all. No movement outside the building. Another 20 minutes passed. I think by then, I'd pretty much came to terms that whatever I heard was nothing, as I was back to not paying as much attention. Then, a sound echoed down the hallway. It was faint. A door opening slowly. I jumped up from my chair and walked into the hallway, not believing what I heard. I immediately saw one of the doors was cracked open. Knowing that none of the alarms went off and nothing had shown up on the cameras, I was extremely confused. I was sure that nobody could be in here. I crept over and opened the door a little further, revealing the dark office room. I took a few steps inside, but didn't hear or see anything, so I started to walk further in, going past each office desk. Then, as I got to the back of the room, I saw the slightest movement on one of the walls, like a shadow or something, before I turned my head and instantly locked eyes with a person crouched underneath one of the desks, hair in large dark circles under his eyes. He had a look of both fear and anger, like he was both mad and worried that I'd found him. The instant we saw each other though, he started getting up. I had no idea if he had any kind of weapons on him, so I took no chances and started running for my life. I went into the hallway and out the front doors, which triggered the security alarms and automatically notified the police. I went a safe distance away, then tried to watch the front doors as I waited for the officers to show up. It only took about 30 seconds before the door swung open and the man came running out. He ran around to the other side of the building, and from there I lost sight of him. When officers got there, we downloaded the footage from the whole night, but nowhere in it did we see the man enter the building. So we don't know when or even how they got in. Obviously, the other question is why they broke in. After discussing it with the company, they said they knew nothing about it and didn't find anything missing. I have a hunch that they might have known more than they let on though. Hiring security for their tiny office isn't normal unless you have a reason to. I think it might have actually been an old employee that they knew was a little unhinged. Anyway, I stayed there for another few months, then called it quits for a better job. I never found out anything else about what happened that night. I was pretty young when this happened, I think 16 or 17. It was at my first job, which was just some trashy pizza place. They paid slightly more than other places, and I made extra from tips when I did deliveries, so I stayed there for a while. I don't remember too much about the beginning of my shift this night. I probably started at my regular time, around 6, and was scheduled until 12, but the whole first half of my shift went by like any other day. It was sometime around 10 that we got an order for delivery, so I packed it up and left to drop it off. The place was 15 minutes away, in a small neighborhood. It took me a minute to find the house though, because all the trees were blocking the address numbers, and a lot of the homes had long driveways leading far from the road. Eventually I did find it, after circling back a few times. I drove down the driveway and parked closer to the home. It was one of those large houses that looked like it was built forever ago. I got the food and walked up to the front porch. It was hard not to notice how quiet it was in this neighborhood. It felt like I was so far away from everything, especially with the trees everywhere. When I got up to the porch though, the front door was wide open. I'd seen a lot of people leave their doors cracked open before, but the way this one was fully open was a little bit excessive. Anyway, I walked over and knelt down to set the food inside the house, when a voice called out, "Hey, would you mind bringing the pizza in here? I'm just setting up the table." It was a man's voice, but they sounded friendly. I knew it was frowned on to enter someone's home while delivering, but honestly, it was a fairly normal request, and usually didn't take more than a few extra seconds, and typically secured a good tip. I stepped inside and walked down the hallway into the kitchen. I set the box on the table, but nobody else was in there. I'd just heard his voice only moments ago, and I never heard him walk anywhere else. I also noticed the house was extremely quiet, like no other sounds at all. I felt a shiver run through me, and as I decided to leave, his voice called out again. "Can you bring it in here, please?" His voice came from the other hallway connecting to the kitchen. There was a single door that was open, but whatever room was behind it was dark. There was no light on. It also sounded like his voice came from right behind the doorway, like he was standing just out of sight. After a few seconds, I turned around and fast walked back out the front door. I got in my car and drove back to work, and I never said a word about it. I thought I'd either get made fun of for being scared or for being stupid, so I just kept it to myself. Thinking back on it now though, there was definitely something up with that guy. Nothing about that encounter was normal. I'm just glad that at least I was smart enough to leave when I did, because there's really no saying what would have happened if I went into that room with him.
In 2017, in my last semester of high school, some friends and I decided to skip the pep rally for the girls' varsity basketball team making the playoffs for the first time. My last period of the day was theater tech. I was just taking it as a fine arts credit, and two friends of mine in the grade below me were in that class with me. We decided to skip the pep rally, leave school early, and go to the nearby Taco Bell like we did every day. However, administrators and security guards patrolled the parking lots to catch kids trying to skip. So we took a detour through the nature trail on campus in order to avoid them. Once in the nature trail, we came across this kid I hadn't seen before. He was a skinny white kid with shaggy black hair, wearing baggy jeans and a plain white t-shirt. He was shorter than me, but the most notable thing about him was his general look of dishevelment. His hair was wild and full of leaves and twigs, and his plain white t-shirt was dirty and the knees of his jeans were stained green and brown. He looked like he had been crawling around in the trail. I remember wondering if he lived there for a split second. When we came up upon him, we were walking in one direction, parallel to the school and to the back of the parking lot, and he was coming directly toward us. I knew the nature trail well enough to know that there was a bend that led deep into the woods, and I figured he had come from there. He was out of breath and he seemed scared. Weird. My two friends said hi to him, because my friends were in the grade below me and later told me that the kid was in their grade and were just acquaintances with my two friends. It was supposed to be just a quick hello, but I couldn't help but notice how scared he looked and how suspicious he seemed of us. He asked us what we were doing in the woods, and we told him we were skipping the pep rally. One of my friends asked, "What have you been doing out here? Camping?" Me and my other friend gave a nervous laugh, but the kid didn't crack a smile. He explained that he was dropped off at school that morning and was supposed to get on a bus to take him to DAEP, which is the alternative school that kids who got suspended from school went to. His plain outfit started to make sense now. It was the infamous uniform of the alternative school. He then explained that he didn't want to go to the alternative school, so when his mom dropped him off, he pretended like he would wait for the bus and then hide in the trail for the full 8 hours of the school day. He was still acting really skittish though, and without even looking at each other or speaking to each other, my friends and I could feel that something wasn't right with him, and that we were in some kind of danger. The kid looked around nervously often, as if seeing if someone might have followed us or if we were alone in the woods. Not long after this, we hit him with a, "Alright man, well, good luck. We're going to try to get to our cars and go home before the pep rally ends." When he heard the word cars, he perked up. He started walking with us towards the parking lot, continuing to talk. He becomes a lot more friendly and asks if we can give him a ride home. We give him some half-baked excuse as why we couldn't do that. You know, we didn't expect him to ask that because I never met him and my friends barely knew him. But he really wasn't taking no for an answer. He tells us that people were going to start looking for him pretty soon, that he was going to be in a lot of trouble. We told him that he'd probably be fine hiding there in the woods, but he tells us, "Nah man, you don't understand. I broke into a car at the fellowship." He then pointed in the direction of the megachurch that had a parking lot that backed up to my school. I took this. From his waistband, he pulled out a handgun and I felt sick to my stomach. I had never seen a gun in real life before. At this point, I felt in danger. Not just because he pulled a gun. I had never really been scared of them. More so that the entire interaction felt uneasy, and that the guy was already unsettling and desperate. One of my friends very cautiously tells him that he should probably just ditch it and take off somewhere. He just stood there, staring at us for an uncomfortable amount of time. His eyes were meeting each of ours. I broke the silence by saying that we wouldn't tell anyone, but that we really had to go before the pep rally ended. And my other stupid-ass friend, who had been virtually silent the entire time, spoke up and said, "Yeah, and it's best we're not around if they start looking for you for that," gesturing to the handgun. His eyes narrowed, and once more he asked if one of us could take him home. This time it felt more like a command. I've never been a super brave person, but in that moment, I don't know why I just blurted out, "Nah man, I'm good." Again, there was an uncomfortable silence. Then he asked, "Before you leave, do you guys want to see something?" My first friend was kind of a hothead, and although he was uncomfortable with the situation, I don't think he was afraid of conflict. Nor was I, but my other friend, however, was not a fan of conflict and would always de-escalate first. We all looked at each other, and me and my first friend kind of had an unspoken understanding like, this is going to happen. If we have to run or fight, we might have to do it now. My other friend was very visibly afraid. He asked, "What do you want to show us?" And before the kid could answer, my first friend said, "We don't want to see. We have to go." My first friend started briskly walking past the kid, and me and the other friend quickly followed. Within a few steps, we just started sprinting towards the parking lot. I looked back once we were about 50 steps away, and he was still standing there watching us run. He had put the gun back in his waistband before taking a small adjacent trail back deeper into the woods. By the time we made it to the parking lot, there were police everywhere. We were sweating, out of breath, and terrified. They found the kid in the next 10 minutes or so. Somehow in the chaos, nobody saw us exit the nature trail and into the parking lot. But since there were so many cops in the parking lot, we decided to just head back inside through another side door to find that the door was locked. That's when an administrator had found us, brought us inside, and shoved us into a classroom where we were able to talk with others and find out exactly what was going on. This is what we could piece together from what we learned. Turns out that the kid had skipped DAEP, like he said, hid in the nature trail, broke into a car at the church, and stole a semi-automatic shotgun and a handgun from the car. After stealing the guns, he texted his girlfriend and he told her that he was about to do something really terrible, and that when she saw his name on the news, she should turn off the TV. He told her explicitly how he was going to hurt some kids at the school. She knew he was supposed to be in class and was so worried about the text that she contacted the police. The school was put on lockdown until officers got a call from a guy at the church that 2 guns had been stolen from his car behind the school. And that's when they put 2 and 2 together and caught him hiding in the woods. I guess when he saw me and my 2 friends in the nature trail, he quickly hid the shotgun but didn't have time to hide the pistol. Or maybe he didn't care enough to hide it. I was only 16 and in high school at the time of this story. It was just a regular day at school. I had finished my lunch and I was heading back to class when suddenly the intercom came to life. "Attention, all students and staff," the principal's voice echoed through the cafeteria. "We are now on lockdown. This is not a drill. Please remain in your classrooms until further notice." I felt a chill run down my spine as the chatter in the cafeteria turned into silence. Lockdowns weren't common at our school, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of despair that was gnawing from the inside of me. I quickly gathered my things and I followed the students as we were being directed to hide in the gymnasium and in the school locker rooms. I checked my phone hoping for some news or updates, but the signal was weak and I couldn't get any information. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the hallway, followed by screaming. My heart raced as I realized that the danger was closer than I had thought it was. I could hear the sound of heavy footsteps approaching from down the hall. My classmates and I huddled and we moved faster together, trying to remain as quiet as possible. We had no idea what was coming our way. The seconds ticked by slowly and we all tried to snugly fit together. It was so packed that it took like 5 minutes before I made the split decision. It was taking too long for all of us to fit through the gym and into the locker room as there was just so many of us. I decided to run through one of the open doors in the gym that led outside where the gym teacher was. I'm not sure what he was doing, but he didn't even try to chase me. I ran to the back of the school and through the soccer field, and I hid near the woods. I whipped my phone out and I attempted to call my mom, when suddenly I turned around after hearing, "What are you doing?" It was a familiar face. Tanner. I knew who he was, but not very well. He had been in some of my classes all through the school years growing up, and he was just staring at me with his menacing eyes and brandishing a weapon. My breath caught in my throat as I looked at him in horror. I couldn't even speak for a second. He had a handgun holstered to his hip and an M4-styled rifle equipped in his hands, and he was pointing it at me. "Hey man, don't do this," I said, pleading for help. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins as he debated on blowing my head off. I stood up and faced him, in the heat of the moment practically thinking this might be the end, and my heart pounding in my chest. To my surprise, I saw a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. I knew I had to try and reason with him, to make him see that there was another way. "Man, you have to stop what you're doing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This doesn't have to end like this. Please think about what you were doing." To my relief, he actually lowered his weapon after about 5 minutes of pleading with him. and he weirdly broke down and started crying. I could see the desperation and pain in his eyes as he revealed he wanted the pain to end. Without warning, Tanner turned and left me alone, leaving me in a state of perpetual shock. I knew I had to do something though. I couldn't just sit there and wait for the worst to happen. I made a split-second decision again, and I decided to leave the school grounds completely. I could see the playground in the distance, so I ran towards it, hoping to find somewhere I felt more safe. I crouched behind a fence by the swings, trying to catch my breath, and while I figured out what to do next, I suddenly heard footsteps approaching and I knew I had to act fast. Peeking out from my hiding spot, I saw Robert. Oh man, it was nice to see him because he was one of my best friends at the time, and he said he saw me run out of the school when I did, and he ended up following me. He said he saw the whole thing where Tanner had me held at gunpoint, and he said he almost lost me trying to find me here. Tanner didn't go on to hurt anyone that day, unlike he planned. And surprisingly, he willingly let the officers arrest him. It's crazy how I had barely escaped a terrible outcome. I ran home as fast as I could and told my mom everything while she hugged me and we cried. Tanner was a kid who had been bullied his whole life. That obviously doesn't give him the right to kill people, but man, something in our world needs to change. So I guess it's been about 9 years or so now, which seems pretty unbelievable to me. It's such a vivid memory that it almost seems fresh, but I think that may also be because I've repeated it so many times by now that I pretty much have an entire monologue memorized, recounting exactly what I experienced. Seems pretty weird to say it, but I was definitely lucky in some way. Luckier than most. I knew some kids that saw a lot more of what happened that day than I did. In my opinion, I've pretty much moved on from the shooting. I haven't really suffered from any long-term emotional scars, but a few of those guys ended up pretty screwed up from it all. I know one girl who was super outgoing and smart before the shooting. She ended up dropping out of school our junior year because of a heroin problem. Or that's the rumor at least. A few years ago, my sister found out that she had overdosed after she got out of rehab, leaving her 2 small kids with only their elderly grandparents left to raise them. Unfortunately, a seemingly large part of my former classmates have also struggled with severe emotional problems and depression, which definitely resulted from that day. Anyways, I guess I'll start this off like I always do. I remember it being one of the last few weeks of freshman year. It was cloudy, as it often is during the springtime in Oregon. What I remember thinking that was initially odd about that day is that it seemed much too warm for the sun to be hidden behind such a thick layer of clouds. It was hot, sticky, humid, and overall extremely uncomfortable. The high temperatures had forced almost all the students and teachers to the courtyard during passing time, 10 minutes between classes, in order to achieve some temporary relief from the stuffy, non-air-conditioned classrooms that we were stuck in all morning. I have 2 sisters. One is a year younger and still in middle school at the time. My older sister was a sophomore, but happened to be home with the stomach flu that entire week. Thank God. It was a Friday, and I remember everyone was really looking forward to our long Memorial Day weekend. My parents were supposed to take my sisters and I out for a weekend at a nearby resort in town, which is a popular thing to do among our community. I spent the entire time before school making plans with friends and chatting about the various 15-year-old shenanigans we would partake in. To say that our weekend plans had changed would be an understatement. I had PE first period that quarter, and we spent the time playing flag football out on the stadium turf behind the school. Since I had a free second, I volunteered to take the equipment back to the supply closet in the upstairs gym, while everyone else went to the locker rooms to get ready for their next classes. We had 2 gyms and locker rooms on the west side of the school, and a large enclosed courtyard separating them from the other classrooms and administration office. I had finished putting the cones, pennies, and whatnot in their place, and headed downstairs to the locker room, deciding to leave the supply closet open for the next gym period, which has turned out to be the single best decision I've ever made in my entire life. I had nearly gotten to the bottom of the stairs when I heard a loud pop, pop, pop. I stopped dead in my tracks as my mind tried to process the noise I just heard. My confusion turned to horror as I heard the screams and saw everyone left on the west side of campus, sprinting down the hallways and through the closest door they could find, and slamming them shut. I turned running back upstairs as fast as I could, and heard 5 more gunshots by the time I got back to the closet, and I shut the door behind me. All I could do was sit in the corner and bury my head in my knees, sobbing. I heard 3 more scattered gunshots, then nothing. Nothing for what felt like an eternity. I can't even begin to describe how slow time was passing. I had absolutely no sense of time because my cell phone was still downstairs in the locker room, and there was no way in hell I was leaving the safe blackness of the supply closet. The worst part about hiding in the closet was not being able to talk to my mom and let her know I was okay. I just sat there and cried, praying and thanking any God who would listen to me that my sister was safe at home. I would have driven myself insane with worry if I was stuck alone in that closet and not knowing whether or not my sister was okay. I sat and waited for what felt like either was going to be my safety or my death. It seemed like hours before I heard the footsteps. There's no way to describe the feeling of being alone in total darkness, overwhelmed with this amount of fear. All of a sudden, I didn't feel like I was completely alone. I heard 2 sets of footsteps running up the stairs and into the gym, and then nothing. Until I was startled to near death as one final pop radiated through the gym rafters. My ears rang as I attempted to accept my impending death, in the fetal position on the floor as footsteps headed slowly toward the closet door. I watched the strip of light under the door as a shadow of 2 feet blocked the light, and I was overcome with terror. I heard the doorknob shake aggressively, and I began to sob, thinking of losing the chance to see my family again, that my fate was stuck in the hands of an angry psychopath on a shooting spree, looking for the opportunity to execute me as I crouched helplessly in a dark and lonely closet. Before I knew it, the doorknob had been broken off. The next few moments are the most vague in my memory as a member of the SWAT team pulled me to my feet and ran with me by his side. It was so fast my feet barely felt the ground. He kept my head down, but that didn't hide everything. I saw so much blood under my feet on the pathways as the officer rushed me through my school courtyard and murder scene. I didn't know him, but I heard of him from my sister. He was a junior at the time and a very depressed and bitter boy. I guess he had few friends, if any, and always seemed to have a temper. She witnessed him one time throw desks and sometimes would have huge temper tantrums in the class when he didn't understand the material. From what I have been told, this is more or less what went down. As I was finishing up in the supply closet, there was an altercation in the courtyard involving the gunman. He had words with another student and pulled out his gun, shooting the other kid 3 times before opening fire on the crowd as chaos ensued following the first round. After fatally shooting both the student and a language arts teacher, he ran into the west wing of the school and hid underneath the bleachers in the downstairs gym for a while. After a while, his cover was blown, and he ran upstairs to the gym where I was followed by an officer, and then was shot and pronounced dead, which I didn't see, thank God. It was a pretty terrifying experience, and I suffered from a lot of anxiety for a while after this, but I've lived a pretty successful life since then. One thing I've taken away is that no matter where I am, I always make a point to eye the nearest escape and plan of action, just in case. This happened just a few days ago. For reference, I frequent a certain local alt hangout spot just about every night to have a few drinks and hang out with my crowd of regulars, who are almost like my family. Spring break for a lot of people was last week, which meant that a lot of old friends and former regulars came back to town and spent some nights at the bar like old times. Among this disparate group of people is a friend of mine whose identity I will protect by referring to them as Allison. Allison is very cute, but we were never that close and we never hooked up, so I'm courteously stuck in the friend zone, so to speak. Though that's not a problem for me, as I'm not interested in making things weird between us or forcing myself into a long-distance relationship. I can be a gentleman. Anyway, Allison likes to drink a lot. Most of us around this place has some kind of developing substance issue. Since she's a small, attractive female, all of her friends, myself included, make sure to look out for her when she gets drunk, just to make sure that nobody gets a chance to try anything nefarious. Recently, though, something despicable very nearly happened. It was the night of St. Patrick's Day, and I was very drunk and high after hanging out with my old friends who were in town. I had a blackout between 2 and 3 in the morning, but by 4, I was back in my body and sobering up. The only people still hanging out at the time were myself, Allison, a friend of mine, and the owner of the establishment. We bummed around for a while until about 5 when the owner finally kicked us out. That left just me, Allison, and our mutual friend in the parking lot. We were having our last little chat for the night and about to say goodbye when something very unexpected happened. Allison's ex-boyfriend literally freaking appeared out of nowhere, just pulling up to the parking lot in the middle of the night. I hadn't seen him around all evening, and it's not uncommon for Allison to sleep in her car after everyone else leaves, so it was quite obvious to all three of us that he had come just to see her. I'll call him Josh. When he appeared, all three of us traded a look. I was immediately glad that I and my friend were still there, and that Josh hadn't successfully pulled up on Allison while she was alone. As if he had pulled up just a few minutes later, he would have been knocking on her car door in an otherwise completely empty parking lot. It's less important, but Josh is a little older and a cocaine addict, and wants Allison to be his little punk rock doll. They split months ago, the last time Allison left town, but Mance has been picking the scab the entire time. He won't just move on, you know? It's not like any of us hated him, it's just that he's not a good match, and everybody can see that except him. Of course, he started acting extremely clingy that night. We were all pretty much wasted except for him, and I could tell by the way he looked at us that he knew this. When he started to stand so close to Allison that she took steps away and tried to hug her for old time's sakes, or whatever he said. I went back to the back door of the bar and tried to get the owner to come out to help survey the situation, but unfortunately, the whole place was locked up and his car was gone already. By the time I got back, my old friend was saying goodbye. I dapped him up and I pulled him in a bit, trying to give him a look in the eyes that said, "Don't you dare leave," but he didn't get it. Then it was just me, Allison, and Josh. Allison tried to say goodnight and sleep in her car, but this was the moment that Josh had been waiting for since he saw the rest of us there. He said, "No, that's not safe. Let me just give you a ride home." I immediately tried to counteract this by saying how she's always done this and it's never been a problem, and how Allison had been talking about sleeping in her car for almost an hour and probably just wanted to follow through with what she had planned. But none of this worked. Josh was extremely pushy, and I never put my foot down hard enough. Eventually Allison caved and accepted the ride. We all said goodbye and got into our cars, then sat in the parking lot for a minute. The whole time I heard this voice in my head that told me not to let her get in the car with him. But I was so faded I could barely listen to it. However, I was still in the presence of mind to look out for my friend, despite how nervous I was about the situation. As they pulled out, I got in line behind them. We rolled through to the exit together, where we both should have turned right, but then Josh made a left turn. My heart jumped into my throat. I knew full well that Allison didn't live down that way, but it seemed like Josh was counting on me not knowing her well enough to be aware of that, but he was wrong. I took a deep breath and gave them about 5 seconds of follow distance, then made a left turn to follow them. I left plenty of room, but made sure I could still see where they were going. I had to run 2 red lights just to not let them get too far ahead, though, which made me worried that I was about to get pulled over or something. The longer it went on with them going the wrong way, the more sure I was that something was up. Eventually, Josh made another left turn into a side street. I sped up and careened into the turn, knowing they could make another random turn and lose me, but I wasn't even sure if they were aware I was following them. As soon as I made the turn, though, I swore I couldn't see them. There were no taillights on the road, but luckily there weren't too many other turns that they could have made. Luckily, just a few seconds later, as I was slowly rolling through the neighborhood, I saw Josh's car. They were parked on the side of the street with their lights already off. I swore again, with malice and anger this time, then pulled up in the spot right in front of his car. I left it running in park and quickly got out. I didn't even have a second to look out into their windshield, because they were both already getting out. It was a hectic few seconds that followed. Allison slammed the door behind her and ignored both of us completely, walking to my car with her arms crossed, jumping into my passenger seat and slamming the door too. The whole time, Josh was yelling at her to come back. He even started to walk up to her, but I stopped him. I don't even think I said anything to him. I just gave him a look that told him to back off. He clenched his jaw in a way that made me tense up, expecting a sucker punch to come my way. Then he just pushed me back and muttered something venomous as he turned around and got back into his car. In that moment, actually, I was the most afraid, because in this country, somebody you're in a fight with, getting back into their car means 2 things. They're either backing off or grabbing their gun. I literally ran back into my car and sped off faster than I ever have in my life. Once I got back on the road and on the way to Allison's house, I tried talking to her, but she was totally clammed up and curled into a ball in my passenger seat. The most I got was when I asked if I needed to call the police, and to that I got a very slight head shake to indicate no. When we were passing the bar, she finally spoke, asking me to not drop her off at home and let her sleep in her car. I obliged, figuring she probably didn't want to interact with her parents. I helped her in and made sure it was locked up. Then I sat in my car and watched over her until sunrise, when other cars finally started pulling in. The next day, she was back at the bar and trying her best to act normal. When I got her inside, I asked her about it again and double-checked if I should have called the cops. She again said no, but this time added that it was only because I got there when I did. My heart sank when she said that, and I told her she should at least tell a few close friends about this, to which she agreed. Now, Josh is basically the same on-site order as a neo-Nazi. We may not be the best group of our friends on account of how we enable each other's self-destructive habits, but god damn it, when it comes to certain things, we look out for each other. An assault of this sort is something you're lucky to just get beaten for.
Hello, my name is Kim Thuy. I'm hosting a new podcast series from the Canadian Museum of History. It's called Artifactuality, and it imagines a museum made up of stories told by the people who are making history today.
In Quebec, we have an expression which says, "We were not born to do little things."
You can listen to Artifactuality and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
This happened to me 2 years ago, and I know most people never experience a lockdown situation, and if they do, it usually would happen at school. But this actually happened to me during my retail job one night. I used to work in Des Plaines, which is a suburban area located north of Chicago. It was pretty much a regular day at work to start, and I mainly worked closing shifts because of school, so I'd get out around 10. Around 4 o'clock, my coworkers started showing around news stories coming out about riots currently happening down in the city. This was due to a certain police incident that was happening at the time. It was pretty intense though, as the rioters were breaking into stores and completely trashing everything, and even beating up employees. I honestly wasn't entirely sure what the reasoning was for harming the stores, but it was crazy. By 6 o'clock, the riot and protests were only getting bigger, with thousands of people participating and hundreds of stores being destroyed and looted. There was even talk of action spreading over to the outer areas of Chicago, including some of the suburban areas nearby. I was definitely keeping my eyes open and watching customers to make sure I was prepared for anything to happen. Another 2 hours went by, and at this point it seemed like the entire city was going up in flames, and some of my coworkers actually left early because they were so nervous. My manager that was working that night was a really understanding guy, and we didn't have many customers coming in anyways, so he didn't mind them going home early. I stayed though, as I really wasn't too worried, and knew I wouldn't be getting paid unless I stayed. Pretty soon I realized that that was a mistake. I was stocking product in an aisle on the far left side of the store, which was opposite of the main entrance, when I heard some yelling outside. I went to the front of the aisle, where I could look out the windows towards the front of the store, and I could see some people running around, but the glare from inside made it hard to actually see what was going on through the window. I started making my way towards the entrance of the store, when the intercom came on, and I could hear my manager announce that the store was now in lockdown and everyone needed to immediately make their way to the back. Against my better judgment, my curiosity got the best of me, and I went a little bit further so I could see out of the front doors, which I was unaware of at the time had already been locked shut. I saw 10 to 15 people running along the windows, banging on the glass and trying to push and smash the doors open. It was one of the most shocking things I've ever seen in my entire life. I immediately started sprinting to the back of the store, noticing other employees and customers doing the same. When I got to the back, I saw my manager guiding people into the large refrigerated room where we keep deli meat and produce. For those who haven't worked in grocery stores or any other place with refrigerated rooms, these rooms are basically large insulated coolers with a huge metal door and usually some plastic flaps on the entrance as well. Anyways, I made my way in. I must have been one of the last people to make it, as just a few seconds later my manager sealed the door and locked it from the inside. I felt pretty safe in there, as I knew nobody could realistically break in without some real heavy tools. But what scared me was how long I'd be in there for. Like, what if a whole mob of people waited outside the door? I'd say there was a good 30 to 40 people in there with me, and a lot of them were really panicking, asking us if that door was going to hold. My manager calmed them down a little bit, but that's when we started to hear noise from within the store. Stuff shattering, falling over, screaming and yelling. I'll admit, hearing those noises in real life was terrifying. I was shaking, as we could hear the sounds more and more clearly while they made their way towards the back of the store. Soon, their footsteps could be heard outside the room, and then a few seconds of silence before the door shook as someone attempted to open it. I guess they realized pretty quick that it was locked from the inside, and they started yelling and banging on it, screaming at us to open the door. We all tried to stay as quiet as we could, but some of the customers started crying as we could hear more people on the outside join in on the screaming and banging. One of them even yelled, "This is the police, open up," trying to fake us out or make fun of us or something. This went on for probably 15 minutes of constant banging and screaming before it began to slow down. Over the next 30 minutes, it slowly got calmer as most of them put their attention elsewhere. Every once in a while, someone would come around and bang on the door a few times and then leave. It took almost an hour of being in there for the police to clear the building and let us out safely. Walking out, the whole store was trashed. Shelves were pushed over, and product was scattered all over the floors. It was really crazy to see the store look like that. Anyways, as far as I know, the violence was mostly cleared overnight in the suburbs, but I think it continued down in Chicago for a few days. It was definitely the most intense situation I'd ever been in though, and I'm glad everyone in the store was able to make it out unharmed. I was 13 at the time, and was in middle school. Our school was pretty small, and nothing ever really happened, so I'd never been in any dangerous situation at school before this day. It was the start of the day, and I had just gotten to my second period class, which for me was English. The class went by as usual, with lectures and reading example writings. It was one of my least favorite classes, as I just found it boring. Anyways, the class was silent, as we were supposed to be reading an example paper, when suddenly the speaker makes a loud beep and turns on. "We are now in lockdown. This is not a drill." Everyone in the class began looking around at each other, confused and a little nervous. Like I said, I just never thought anything would ever happen here, so it was really shocking and confusing to hear that we were in lockdown, and it made me wonder what was actually going on. After a few seconds, my teacher started taking command and told us all to line up on the side of the wall by the door. Then he rushed to lock the door and turn off all the lights, but I guess the power cut out before he was able to himself. A couple of the girls in the class started crying a little, which I understand as it was a pretty stressful and suspenseful situation. I want to say almost 10 minutes went by with absolutely no sounds or anything, before sudden running footsteps could be heard going through the hallway outside of our classroom. Once they reached our class, they stopped abruptly. I could feel the whole room holding their breath as we waited, listening nervously. Then a boy started banging on the door, pleading us to be let into the classroom. I was honestly terrified, as I couldn't tell how old the boy sounded, and I looked over at my teacher, who looked equally as terrified as all of us. He got up and moved towards the door slowly, looking through the window. Then he quickly opened the door and let the boy in. I recognized him from just seeing him walking around the hallways before, but we never had any classes together. My teacher asked if he was okay,
and then told him to sit along the wall with all of us. Once we were all settled again, I leaned over and whispered to him, asking what happened. He said he was in the bathroom during the lockdown and waited for a while before some middle-aged man came in and started banging on all the stall doors. Apparently, once the guy banged on his stall, he crawled under the side of the stall and made a run for it. Luckily, the man only chased him down a small hallway before letting off. This sent chills down my body, as if I suddenly realized that this was really happening and we were in real danger by some crazy guy. Not even a minute later, clear, loud footsteps were heard approaching our classroom door. Some of the other kids in the room were holding their mouths shut, trying to muffle their crying, as a single bang on the door echoed through the room. A few seconds later, 2 or 3 more sets of footsteps walked up to the door, and the group began talking to each other. It was too muffled to hear what they were saying, but knowing that it was a whole group of dangerous men made my stomach drop. I looked over at my teacher, who was trying to calm one of the girls, but even he seemed terrified. Then one of the men outside yelled, and all their footsteps ran away. I guess the cops had finally shown up. I could feel the sense of relief from the whole class. We stayed there for another 20 minutes before it was all finally clear, and then the situation was dismissed. Apparently a whole group of sketchy guys walked in, asking to pull out one of their kids from a class. Obviously, none of them were actually parents to any of the kids, so the whole thing escalated, and they forced their way into the building. That's about all we were told, but it was definitely a situation that I'll remember for the rest of my life.
Alright, so picture this. I'm called in as a substitute teacher for a class that missed out on a field trip. The regular teacher and most of the students were out on the field trip, while I was left in charge of 4 students who didn't have their parent permission slips signed. To set the scene, I had just finished subbing for another class. Afterwards, I was asked to sub for this class, and the instructions were pretty straightforward. Play a Mythbusters video for the students, and hand out worksheets to keep them occupied. Sounds easy, right? Well, here's where things took an unexpected turn. Barely a few minutes into class with the video playing, the Fab Four, who seemed to be inseparable buddies, all raised their hands and requested to go to the bathroom. Now, being the laid-back sub that I am, I granted their wish, with a friendly reminder to return soon so we could finish the video together. They nodded eagerly, promising to be back in a jiffy, and headed out to the hallway as I paused the video. As I waited for them to return, a couple of minutes went by. Then, I heard a noise come over the intercom. There was an announcement that the school was now going in a lockdown, and this was not a drill. This put me in a little bit of an odd situation. Panic started to settle in as I realized that these 4 kids were nowhere to be seen. Should I go out and search for them? Or should I stick to the lockdown protocols and secure the classroom by locking the doors and turning off the lights? I figured my students should be back any second, and I stood there in my classroom doorway for about another minute or so. In a moment of concern for their well-being, I chose to go find them. I figured they must be hanging out in the nearest bathroom, right? Easy to find, or so I thought. I hurriedly made my way to the hallway, fueled by a mix of worry and determination. I walked to the bathroom as quickly as I could, and I got winded because I'm severely not in shape like I used to be, and I pushed open the bathroom door and knocked. I was hoping to find them and usher them back to the classroom. "Hey guys, we're on lockdown. You need to come back to the classroom," I called out, my voice echoing through the empty bathroom. But to my surprise, there was no response, not a peep. As confusion grew, I cautiously pushed the bathroom door open wider, half expecting them to jump out. But that wasn't the case. The bathroom was empty. Not a single person in sight. My heart sank. Where on earth did these students go? I couldn't dwell on it for long, though, because my priority was to get back to my classroom. If the students had wandered off, then that was their fault. They would likely be found by another faculty member. With a mix of anxiety and haste, I retraced my steps, making my way back to the classroom that I was in charge of. I went inside and remained by the door. 10 long minutes went by, which felt like a whole hour, and still there was no sign of my students. Just when I was about to lose my cool from all the suspense, I heard this weird noise coming from inside the classroom. I quickly scanned the room, hoping to figure out where it was coming from, but there was nothing there, just an empty and super quiet classroom. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then I heard it again. This time, my eyes locked onto this person crouched behind a desk at the back of the room. I cautiously approached, my voice trembling when I asked, "Who's there?" I was praying it was just a student playing an elaborate prank, but to my dismay, the figure that rose up from beyond the desk was no student. It was a man, a complete stranger, and certainly not a student. I freaked out and sprinted out of the classroom immediately, desperate to find help. Now, as a grown adult, you're probably wondering why I bolted and didn't stay in the room and fight him. Well, like I said, I'm not as young as I used to be, and I'm not in shape, so the odds of me winning a fight protecting myself are like 4 out of 10. I pounded on the door of the nearest classroom, and thankfully, the teacher opened the door. Their expression quickly turned to concern as they listened to my explanation of what had happened. Without wasting a second, they dialed the school principal and alerted her about the new situation. Soon enough, the school became filled with activity as police officers were everywhere in the hallways. It turned out that the stranger I had encountered was the very person the school had been locked down for. He must have snuck into my classroom when I was down the hall looking for my students. This realization made my mind go black as I thought about all the possibilities that could have happened if I didn't run away from my classroom. It turned out that the missing students had taken refuge in another teacher's classroom. Nobody had thought to inform me, though. Rumors began to circulate that this intruder had ulterior motives, with whispers of him searching for someone specific or possibly carrying a weapon. The details remained vague, and the school kept the information tightly under wraps. Looking back on that day, I'm just grateful that everybody was okay. After that crazy incident, I needed some serious time off. When I finally went back to teaching, I had a whole new perspective. I will certainly never forget that day.
This happened a few years back during my sophomore year of high school. One thing I should mention is that I went to a public high school that was well known for being one of the largest in the country with a high graduation rate. Each of the 4 classes had over 1,000 students, and the faculty was probably around 1,000 as well, so there were about 5,000 people in the building at the time that this happened. As I would assume most other lockdowns start, the day was pretty normal. I had all my morning classes as usual, then ate lunch and started the second half of my day. I was in physics class at the time, and we were doing a project outside. I asked if I could go back in really fast to use the bathroom, and my teacher said sure. The bathroom was right by the entrance door, so I ran in and did my business. As I was washing my hands, a tall older man in a gray hoodie came in. He looked at me without saying anything and went into the far back stall. I quickly dried my hands and made my way outside. I found it really weird that the guy was dressed like that, because anyone that old had to have been a teacher or a staff member. I didn't recognize him at all, but the school was huge and I really only knew about 1/4 of the staff, so that wasn't exactly a big deal in my mind. Anyways, I went back outside, and after another 15 minutes of working, my teacher started bringing us back inside. Our school has certain areas that classes are allowed to be brought outside in, and the one we were at was pretty far from our classroom, about a 4-minute walk. Just as the whole class was inside and began making our way to the room, the announcement speaker came on abruptly and declared that the whole facility was now in lockdown. We all looked at the teacher, who was equally as confused, but immediately began rushing us towards the classroom while staying quiet. Halfway there, another teacher looked into the hallway and offered to take us in their classroom as it was large and had plenty of space. We all rushed in and sat against the wall while the 2 teachers talked amongst each other about what was going on. The whole time I sat there, I was thinking about that man that I'd seen in the bathroom and questioning if that was the reasoning for this lockdown. It gave me chills just thinking about how close I was to him. We were sitting silently for only a few minutes before we heard someone tapping softly on the window outside. Both teachers motioned for us to stay silent as the tapping continued. Then we heard footsteps in the hallway making their way slowly towards our classroom door. There was a pause, and then a man yelled, "It's okay. I know there's a lot of you in there. Just open the door for me." I started panicking a little bit, and so did most of the class. The men could probably hear the loud crying coming from the room now. The man outside the door started getting more aggressive, yelling and swearing at us as he banged on the door. It sounded like he had a hammer or something, which made all of us even more terrified. This went on for a whole minute before the man that was outside the window yelled for him to stop and said that they had to go right away. Police sirens could be heard from the front of the school, but the man by the door continued banging for another 30 seconds before giving up, and we can hear him running back down the hall. The police caught him on his way out of the building, but they never found the second guy. When they released the man's picture, I didn't recognize him, so I still wasn't sure who the guy was in the bathroom, but I've always just assumed that he was the second man outside the window that they'd never caught. The general theory for the crime was that they were trying to break into the science classrooms to steal the expensive equipment, but I don't think that was ever confirmed, so it's still left as a mystery.
I used to shop at Target all the time, but recently I don't want to go back there, at least not to the location that I live by. Some creepy and weird things happened to me there. There's really only one Target that's close to where I live. It's been my main store for years to get just about anything. There's some other stores that I go to as well, but Target has the best variety. I've always preferred it over Walmart as well. One night, I went shopping after work. I was getting a lot of items, mainly groceries. I got a cart and began shopping around the store. It wasn't all that busy, and that made things go smoothly. After shopping for probably about 30 minutes, I was almost done. My cart had lots of items in it, and I was in the last area of the store that I would be going to, which was the cold section. The refrigerated items and the freezer items is what I would always get last. That way, they wouldn't melt by the time I got home. When I got to that section of the store, it was empty. I was the only person there. They had a freezer at the back of the store, and I was getting something from it, when I saw something strange. It was like movement of some sort behind the items. This particular freezer section was up against the very back of the store leading to the back room. That's when I realized that a person was back there, behind the freezer shelves. I could see between the levels of shelves that they had, but not by much. Somebody was right behind the spot that I was at. At first, I thought it was kind of funny, but I soon realized it wasn't a Target employee. I moved down to get something else, and whoever was there seemed to move down with me. As I was examining a product, I could see that the person was wearing black, not the typical red shirt and khakis that a Target employee would wear. Then, they got closer, and I noticed that I could now see their head through the gap between the shelves. The person was wearing a black ski mask. My only thought was that this was really strange. I moved even further down, and the masked man moved down with me. He was beginning to really freak me out. He kept staring at me from the other side. Luckily for me, I only needed one more item from that aisle. I went to grab it, as the masked man stared at me. Then, as I was reaching for the product, the guy reached over and shoved the whole box of them at me. Multiple items fell onto the floor. I put them back as he disappeared into the freezer. This guy was causing problems, and I decided to tell an employee about him. I walked down a few aisles before finding somebody who worked there. I told them about the guy and how he was inside of the freezer. The employee told me that she would tell the person to leave and that they couldn't be back there. There happened to be doors leading to the back room of the store right nearby, and I watched her walk through them. About a minute later, the employee emerged again. She told me that she couldn't find anybody back there at all. Whoever had been doing that must have left. I hadn't seen anybody else come out of the doors, though. I shrugged it off and was done with my shopping, so I decided to head out. I walked up to the front and paid for everything, then left the store. About a week later, I returned. I would say that I went grocery shopping roughly once a week. I didn't have a specific day or anything like that I would go, but on average it was probably about once. This time that I went back to the Target was just like any other. I did all of my shopping in about 30 minutes or so, and then checked out with all of my items. After I left the store, I walked out to my car and unloaded the groceries into it. Then I started driving home. This particular Target has several other businesses around it, like just past the parking lot. There was also a few trees and bushes around for scenery. As I was driving away, leaving the parking lot, I was driving between some other businesses and the Target parking lot going to a connecting road. That's when I saw the same guy dressed in all black and a ski mask. He was halfway hiding behind a bush, and he popped out and looked directly at me as I drove away. I drove right past him in disbelief. This was the same guy who I had seen last time I had been at this same Target. But this time he was outside, not inside the store. It was crazy to me how I specifically saw him. Maybe he just liked to go to Target and mess with people. I really didn't know. But what I did know is that I was really weirded out by this. The way he was hiding in the bushes was concerning. Luckily, I was away from him now and on the way home. After that experience, I didn't go to Target for almost 2 weeks. When I returned, it was just another routine shopping trip, just like any other. I did my shopping like always and then left the store. It was nighttime again, and things were pretty quiet inside and outside of the Target. I had parked sort of in the middle of the parking lot, about halfway back. There were a few other cars around mine. When I got back to my car, I unloaded the groceries again and got inside. I started my engine and was just about ready to drive away. I happened to glance over at the car that was parked directly next to me to the left for no particular reason. When I glanced over though, I noticed movement. It caught my attention and my eyes stayed focused on it. The entire car had looked empty to me. The car was a standard looking white sedan and the back windows were tinted dark, but the front windows I could see through. That's when somebody emerged from the back seat, crawling over into the front passenger seat. It was a guy wearing all black and a ski mask. My jaw dropped when I saw this. He looked right at me through the windows separating us. He continued to stare at me for probably 5 seconds or so as I sat there in total shock. Then his door started to open. I was so surprised, still from just seeing the guy, that I didn't do anything. It was like I couldn't move. After he opened the door, he stood up and reached for my driver's door. I finally came to my senses and hit the lock switch. Just moments later, the man with the mask tried opening my driver's door, which had just locked. He then leaned in very closely to my driver's window, basically pressing his face against it. I was beyond creeped out. He stared right at me, as close as he possibly could. I yelled at him to go away, but he didn't move. I put my car into reverse and then started backing out. The guy grabbed onto my car as I backed away. He was trying to stay with me, and when I had backed out and began driving, he finally let go. I saw him then run back to the car that he had been inside. I hit the gas harder to leave as soon as possible. Then I was able to make it out of the parking lot, and I quickly turned off to a busier street. After that, I quickly turned into another parking lot and then turned my lights off and parked. I watched, and several seconds later, I saw a car come out of the Target parking lot and drive quickly down the street past me. I was pretty sure that that was the guy. After the car was long gone, I was able to drive home, and I made it back okay. This wasn't all that long ago. Each of the last 3 times I went to that Target, I've seen the same man. Why is he there, and what is he doing? I really don't know. I haven't been back to that Target since. For some background of this story, I'm a female, and I worked at Target for a while, over a year ago. The Target that I worked at was very close to my apartment at the time, and it was a pretty enjoyable job for me. My favorite part was talking with coworkers and becoming friends with them. Mostly what I would do is work in the clothing department. I would do all sorts of things there, and it wasn't very stressful because things usually don't get busy like they do in the grocery section. At the time of this story, I had been working there for almost 4 months. I remember it very well. It all started on a typical day at work. I was in the clothing department, particularly the women's section, straightening up items that were out of place. It was during the daytime, and the store was calm. This is when a tall man approached me. Assuming he was a customer who had a question about something, I greeted him, asking how I could help. The man stood there, looking directly at me with a somewhat creepy grin on his face for a moment. He then said, "Yes, you can help me, by going out with me tonight." I laughed it off. I had no interest in going out with the man, but I wasn't scared of him or anything. I just told him that I had a boyfriend, even though I didn't actually have one. This was always the best way to tell off a guy that I wasn't interested in my experience. The man replied rather quickly, saying, "No, you don't." I told him that I did, and I asked the man if he needed help finding anything. He then responded with an even creepier reply. "Yes, directions to your house." I laughed off this remark as well. I was just hoping that the man was joking around, because this was getting really weird. After he said that, I told him that I had a lot of work to do, and I told him to have a good day. Then I started making my way to another section of the large clothing department that we had. The clothing area was practically big enough to get lost in. I was hoping to lose sight of the man, but when I started moving away, he followed. When I had made it to another section and he was still next to me, I stopped. I didn't have a problem with confrontation, and I said to the man, "Why are you following me? You're kind of creeping me out." The guy put his hands up as if to say, "My bad." He then walked away, and it was a huge relief. I had dealt with customers asking me out or trying to flirt with me a couple of times. It didn't happen very often, but here and there it did. None of them had been nearly as bad as this, though. I kept working for several hours. By then, I had forgotten about my experience earlier, but I soon remembered when I spotted the same man. I couldn't believe it at first. This was now about 3 hours after our first interaction. To me, it was still mind-blowing that he was still in the store. Maybe he had left and then come back. Either way, it was strange, and it was now a bigger concern for me, because shortly after I had spotted him, I saw him look over at me and then look quickly away. The man was sort of far away too. It looked like he was almost hiding from me. He stood, mostly covered by a rack of clothing, staring in my direction. I moved slightly and kept working, to which the man moved slightly as well to keep looking at me. I stopped and sighed. This was really annoying now. I walked away, leaving what I was doing. I moved to a whole nother section of the store, far away from that one. There, I didn't really have any work to do, but I just wanted to get that man off of me. I was now in the grocery area, and I was there for about a minute before spotting the man again. He was walking into the area, and he saw me for a split second, and then disappeared into a nearby aisle. At this point, I decided to take my break. I had one that I could take at any time, and I was planning to after I had finished the work that I was doing in the clothing department. But seeing as this creep was back and still following me around, I decided to just take my break now. I radioed in on my walkie-talkie to let my supervisor know I would be taking my break. Then I headed towards the front end of the store. Our break room was through doors at the front, and I walked in there. When I got inside the break room, I thought back to the crazy situation. Did that man seriously think he was being slick? I mean, I spotted him twice, and it was like he thought I couldn't see him. I just hoped that he would notice I was not there anymore and then leave. I'm not going to lie, I took a little bit extra time on my break. I was pretty concerned to return back out and see the man again. If I did see him, I was going to have to tell a coworker or our security team. I didn't want to have to do that, but I would if it was necessary. When I went back out though, I didn't notice the man anywhere. I went back to work in the clothing department, but was much more alert and constantly looking around. I didn't see the guy for the rest of my shift that night, which was about 2 more hours. I was really happy about this. But still, I thought possibly he was still there looking at me somewhere and had just gotten better about hiding. At the end of the day though, I don't think he was. I left work and went home, not seeing the guy at all. Soon, I forgot all about him. I worked several more times that week, mostly my usual shifts. One night, the very next week, I found myself working on a quiet evening. I was almost done, and it was past the busy amount of customers that we would usually get between 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. I was doing my usual work of organizing a section of the clothing department. That's when I got a call on my walkie. Somebody radioed asking for me, and I radioed back telling them to go ahead. I wasn't quite sure who had said it, but that wasn't uncommon. A big store like Target has so many employees. Plus, there are always new people. A handful of my coworkers, I could instantly recognize their voices over the walkie-talkie, but many of them I could not. After telling them to go ahead, they asked me to go to Channel 3. This is how we would communicate without other employees hearing us. It was used for more descriptive details or directions on what we were supposed to do. After turning to 3, I told them to go ahead again. That's when I was told that I was needed in receiving and to help with something quick. I told them that I was on my way and began walking over. Receiving was the back room of the store basically. I wouldn't work back there a lot, but I had helped with things there several times in the past. It took me a few minutes to walk all the way back there, and when I had made it, I exited the store into the back. Things were very quiet back there. I had expected to see someone there waiting for me. I turned my walkie to Channel 3 again and said that I was in receiving. Nobody said anything, but I heard my voice echo onto somebody else's walkie nearby. I then called out, asking where they were, but I didn't get a response. I walked closer to the voice, which was near one of the doors leading to outside. I noticed that it was open, and I could see outside into the night. That's when I saw the man again. He stepped out from behind a shelf back there. I couldn't believe he was here. "That was you on the walkie, wasn't it?" I said to him. The man just started walking towards me. I backed away as he got closer. I looked at how much taller he was than me. If he tried to grab me, it would be difficult to get away. He got closer, and I turned around, but as soon as I did, he grabbed my arm. Then, he started to pull me backwards. I started yelling, but back there, it wasn't likely anybody would hear me. Suddenly, I heard the doors leading back to the shopping area open. I then saw one of my coworkers, Amy, walking over. I yelled at her, and she asked what was going on. The man let me go and then sprinted out the doors outside. I ran over to Amy and explained to her what had happened. Amy told me that she had heard the person asking me to go to Channel 3. She said that when she didn't recognize the voice and was just being nosy in general, she turned to Channel 3 as well. She was wondering what I was being asked to do. When she heard I was supposed to go to receiving, she found it strange, because she had just been there earlier in the night and wasn't aware of anything that would be done back there. She decided to see for herself, and I'm really glad that she did. We had to call the police and report the incident, but unfortunately, not much could be done. The man had bought a walkie-talkie and got on the same frequency as us, which was not hard to do at all. Many standard walkie-talkies were capable of it. I'm just glad I was all right. I worked at Target for a few months after that, and luckily, never saw the man again. I'm a former Target employee. I worked there 5 years ago, pushing carts in the parking lot. This was one of my favorite jobs that I've had so far, to be honest. It was pretty enjoyable and easy work. However, I do have one really scary story to tell. This is something that still creeps me out when I think about it. I worked at a super Target and it was in a busy area. The store and the parking lot were very big, and they were close to other stores and restaurants that were close by. This made work challenging occasionally because of how busy it would get. One time, I was working a night shift, and it had been really busy in the day earlier, but by now, things were very calm. It felt like the calm after the storm, because the carts were scattered throughout the parking lot, not just in the corrals. This was typical on busy days. When I had the time later, I would go all around the parking lot and retrieve the carts that were not in the corrals. I would also bring all the ones that were in the corrals back to the store as well. Obviously, with how busy it had been earlier, I hadn't been able to keep up with the parking lot as perfectly as I would like. So, it was probably about 9 p.m. or so. I went to the northeast corner of the parking lot. There was a cart that was against the curb at the corner the farthest away from the store. I walked over and got the cart. As soon as I was grabbing it, I noticed an SUV pulling into this area of the parking lot. There was an entrance/exit right there as well. The SUV did not keep driving though. Instead, it stopped right in front of me. I found this kind of strange, but I just got the cart and started walking back to the store. But that's when I heard a voice call out, "Hey!" I looked back and saw a man getting out of the SUV. The vehicle was not parked in a parking space, but just parked there, partly covering 2 different spaces and the driving area. The guy said to me that maybe I could help him with something. I stopped with the cart and looked back to him. I asked him what he needed help with. The man waved me over and I started walking to him. He said that he didn't know if I knew much about cars or not, but he didn't, and something weird was happening with his. The man was short, but looked sort of strong. I did know a little bit about cars, but not a whole lot. I was hoping that I would be able to help the man with this problem though. Then, the man asked me to get inside the backseat of his car and listen to the weird noise it made when he drove. The question really seemed to come out of left field. It took me by surprise, and it also seemed really sketchy. I changed my mind suddenly. "Actually, I really don't know anything about cars," I said. Then, I turned around to get my cart and started walking back over to it. The man told me to wait, but I didn't. I kept walking, making my way back to the Target. I heard footsteps of the man coming after me though. This was really strange. I sped up. The guy behind me seemed to speed up as well. At that point, I decided to just start sprinting. I felt like I was in danger, and I knew if I made it in the Target, I would be safe. I ran all the way there, sprinting with the cart, and the man could not keep up and stopped chasing me. When I got back inside, I decided to work on the other end of the parking lot for a while, and that's exactly what I did. And I also tried to stay close to the building as I collected carts from the other end. Everything went fine. I looked out to the other side of the parking lot where the man and his car had been, and I didn't see him or the SUV. He must have left, which was good. After working for a while, it was time for my final break of the day. It was a 15-minute break. I walked back inside and into the break room. There, I sat on my phone, scrolling through social media and Snapchatting with friends. At that time, I was the only person in the break room. With it being late, there was an overlap of people at the end of their evening shifts or at the beginning of their overnight shifts. Nobody else was taking their break. This was fine with me. About halfway through, I heard the door to the break room open and close. There was a little hallway with a closet that led into the break room. I expected somebody to enter the room, but no one did. I didn't think anything of it. I continued sitting in my chair and looking at my phone, but several moments later, I had a strange feeling. It was like the feeling that I was being watched. I usually don't get this feeling, so when I did, I turned around. That's when I saw the guy who had chased after me earlier. He was standing in the entrance of the break room, looking right at me. Then, he started walking closer to me. I got up and once again sprinted away from the man. I ran out the other exit of the break room, which led to an employees-only area where you punched in, and there was a desk there as well. Nobody was back there at the time. There was also a door leading to outside, and I ran out of it and back into the parking lot. I ran around to the other entrance door and quickly found one of the managers. I told them the whole story, but when they went into the break room, the man was gone. He must have exited after I had. Luckily, I didn't have much time left on the clock. I worked very carefully for the next 30 minutes or so. Then I punched out and went home. I never saw the man again. After this incident, I worked at Target for quite a while. Nothing like that ever happened again, which I'm glad to say.
I used to work at Target many years ago. At the time, they were still open 24/7, so I took the overnight shift as a stalker. I was a night owl in college, so that fit into my schedule the best. As much as Target gets rightfully criticized for being a terrible employer, I actually think it was a decent job for where I was in life. It's common knowledge how strange some of the people that come into the store are. But things are way worse in the middle of the night. Thankfully, I didn't have to interact with most of them, but there were occasions when I was hit on or harassed by crazy people. It didn't usually get that bad. But there was this one guy. He gave me the creeps. He was one of the main reasons I ended up quitting before I was finished with college. He came into the store on a freezing cold night in December. Long after the hours when the store was still full of customers, when there was barely anyone there except for a few employees. I was crouched down stocking boxes of pasta when I noticed a man walk past the entrance to the aisle. A moment later, he reappeared at the end of the shelves, but he didn't walk into it just then. He stared at me instead. I could see it out of the corner of my eye, but I tried to ignore him. He lingered long enough for me to get a read on him from just a few glances. He was disheveled and dirty, not carrying anything, and a stench of stale feces and urine was already wafting over from him. Eventually, he started walking toward me. Once he was about 5 feet away, he stopped and stared down at me again. By then, the odor of his filth was overpowering. After a few unbearable seconds of silence, he finally opened his mouth and asked where he could find popcorn. I pointed it out to him and he walked away. But I noticed something weird as I watched him go out of the aisle. He had a strange limp as he walked, almost a waddle. Then, he reached back and scratched his crack, seemingly adjusting something inside his pants. Just before he walked out of sight, I confirmed there had to be something inside his pants. Whatever it was big, and it was sandwiched between his cheeks by his waistband. I didn't want to imagine what it could be, but I came up with a few possibilities before I successfully pushed it out of my mind. None of them were good. Thankfully, a few minutes later, I had already forgotten about it. I got back into my stocking flow and wasn't thinking about anything in particular. just passively longing for the day when I could get out of this menial job and do something more interesting for a living. I was snapped out of my trance by the reappearance of the putrid man. Once again, he stood at the end of the aisle and stared. This time, there was a slight smile on his face. He returned without any popcorn. I knew that out of everything in the store, the only thing he was interested in was me. He approached me again, stepping a bit closer than the previous encounter. The rank stench almost made me gag. I didn't want to look at him or even be around him, but he kept talking to me, trying to flirt. He said he couldn't help but come up and tell me how sexy I was, to which I replied with a simple thanks and a fake smile. He pressed me for information about where I lived, how old I was, if I had a boyfriend, all the typical stuff creeps feel entitled to ask about. I gave fake answers to everything, trying to give him every reason in the world to stop talking to me, but none of it worked. Eventually, he asked for my number, saying we should get together and make a baby with my beautiful genes. I declined outright at first, but after he asked me multiple times and made it clear that he wouldn't take no for an answer, I finally copped out and gave him a fake number. He walked away with a big grin on his face, as if he thought he had actually chatted me up and had a chance of getting in my pants behind whatever dumpster he lived behind. Once again, I noticed that weird limp and the impression of something big in his pants as he walked away, but I was no closer to figuring out what it was. After I finished unloading the cart, I took it to the back end of the store to get a full one. I needed a break after that guy, so I purposely stalled around by the door. Nobody was around to catch me slacking off. I figured I could stand there for about 5 whole minutes without anyone bothering me. Right as I was about to finally leave, the man busted through the door, screaming in my face and threatening to kill me for giving him a fake number. I jumped back in shock, hiding behind the boxes on the cart. The rotting creep asked me if I wanted to know what he did to people that lied to him. I didn't know what that meant, so of course I said no and asked him to calm down, but it had no effect. Then, right in front of my eyes, to my horror, he reached back and stuck his hand down his pants, about to grab something and take it out. I screamed and sprinted out the door. He tried to grab me as I passed him, but I escaped with just a scratch from his filthy fingernail. I ran out of the store and into my car. He was much slower than me and couldn't catch up, but as I pulled out of the parking lot, I looked back and saw him standing in front of the store, holding something I couldn't make out. I drove off and called the night manager to tell him what was happening. It took him a minute to understand why I wasn't coming back for the night, but he did call the cops to find the man. However, he wasn't there by the time they arrived. That scratch on my arm ended up getting infected badly and needed antibiotics. That just goes to show how disgusting he was. Yet, to this day, I still don't know what he was about to pull out of his pants, or whatever horrible experience I managed to escape from. I can only imagine the worst. Target was the worst place I ever worked at. But it isn't Target's fault. I had recently graduated from college and got a new apartment with an old friend of mine, but I couldn't find a job in my area of expertise in time, so I had to get a day job to make ends meet, and Target accepted my application. Of course, I quickly grew to despise working there. I couldn't relate to any of my coworkers. Most of them were generally lifeless and irritable people. Something about that place was soul-sucking. The customers were weird and often aggressive. The job itself was repetitive and menial, and the management was insufferable. In my short stint as a Target employee, I cashiered, stocked, cleaned, did customer service, and walked around as a general associate helping customers. Usually, the days I got to spend walking around were my favorite. However, the worst day I ever spent working at Target was a day when I happened to be walking around. Everything was fine for the first hour or so. I was actually having a somewhat pleasant shift. But then, my rare little rosy moment was incinerated by the sound of one voice. Someone behind me called my name. I recognized the voice like a shell-shocked soldier remembers the sound of artillery fire. I didn't even have to turn around to know who it was. It was my ex-girlfriend, Samantha. I'd broken up with her nearly a year ago. She was beautiful and amazing in bed, but everything else about her was a nightmare. She was diagnosed bipolar as a teenager, but had been refusing to take her prescribed medication ever since she started going to college. Her particular case was severe, though she refused to seek help. As a partner in a relationship, she was paranoid, controlling, jealous, and violent. I was never seriously hurt or traumatized by her, but once the force of nature compelling me to breed subsided, I realized I had made a grave mistake by getting with her. I broke things off, sparking several hellish months of repercussions. I blocked her on everything, but she incessantly found ways to contact me and find out where I would be to confront me, either begging for forgiveness and a chance to talk things through or screaming at me about how I was a horrible person. I continuously shut her down, and while things got dicey for a while, she eventually calmed down and seemed to finally disappear from my life. I hadn't seen her in months. I thought she was finally gone. In that moment, I heard her voice. My blood turned ice. She was standing right behind me. When I turned around, what was already an awful circumstance for me became the absolute worst-case scenario. There she was, grinning and staring me down with empty eyes as always. But instead of wearing a skimpy outfit like she used to do to keep me interested in her body, she was wearing work clothes and a vest, a Target vest. My heart sank to the floor. I couldn't even speak. But Samantha was giddy with excitement. She told me she had just gotten a job at Target, not knowing that I was working there, and had randomly been assigned to me for training. She said it must have been divine intervention, that it was a sign that we were meant to be together. I tried to open my mouth to disagree, but I was in shock. I could hardly fathom what was happening to me, much less form coherent words. What I wanted to say was, what the hell are you doing here? Why can't you get it through your head that I never want to see you again in my life? None of it came out. Samantha approached me, but I managed to back away. She pouted and refrained from coming any nearer, then sheepishly asked if we could be professional and do her training if I didn't want to talk about things. At a complete loss, I went along with it. I finally got my voice back and barely managed to start explaining things to her. We were all right for a few minutes while I kept my eye on her, bashfully smiling and trying to look cute and innocent, but I knew it was all a facade. As soon as I turned my back on her, she grabbed my arm. I immediately ripped her hand off of me and physically recoiled, looking at her with anger and disgust in my heart, just before briskly walking off to my manager's office. Samantha followed me inside. The manager looked up from his computer with confusion on his face. I wasted no time explaining to my boss that I refused to train Samantha on account of our negative history together. What he said in response made my face go numb. He told me he had never hired anyone named Samantha, and he had never seen the woman standing over my shoulder in his life. I looked back at Samantha in pure terror. She was smiling like I had never seen her smile before. It was half childish embarrassment at being caught doing something bad, and half the deep twist